Hi, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And I want to talk about a study, a clinical trial, that was published earlier this year out of one of the leading research institutions in the world, which explores a new potential treatment for depression. So my research focused on trying to identify some of the specific neurons in the brain that encode anxiety and addiction. And let me tell you, it's a complicated web of neurobiology. There's no specific part of the brain that causes these maladies. It's a complicated combination of life experiences and of genetic inheritance. And as a result, the effort to develop effective treatments for these kinds of conditions is among the most challenging in biomedical science. Okay, I'm glad to hear it. Thanks for coming by. And so to give you a sense of one reason that depression is really a dire concern, public health concern. And I apologize that these data are sort of US centric. But according to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, these are the 10 leading causes of fatalities in the United States from just 2 years ago. And so I know that there's a lot going on in that chart, but if you just focus on the green boxes, okay, what you're seeing is age groups increasing from left to right, starting at, or I guess I'm not sure if it's left to right on this, but from one side to the other, right? Starting at just 10 years old, individuals taking their own lives is the second highest cause of loss of life. And that's the case all the way up until people are 34 years old. And as people get older, it remains one of the top causes of loss of life until people are well into their 60s. And so, and beyond that, where are we? Here we go. People have been taking their lives more and more over the past decade. And this is, again, according to CDC numbers. And so, I know I'm sort of obnoxiously focusing on the US, but according to the WHO, 1 in 100 fatalities worldwide is due to someone taking their own life. And, to be clear, depression, of course, isn't the only cause of people doing this, right? The majority of individuals who confront depression don't do this, right? But, and the statistics are complicated. But, regardless, depression is a life-threatening condition that can result in tragic outcomes. It's one of the most dangerous conditions one can be diagnosed with. And so, we're fortunate that there are several strategies to confront depression, but the efficacies of those treatments leave, quite a bit to be desired due to issues like side effects that affect quality of life, just as well as levels of efficacy that could be higher for a variety of reasons. And so before I get on my soapbox about why we don't already have more effective treatments, more effective medications, let's get to the study for today. So pharmacology nerds might already have a sense of the subject that I'd like to discuss today, but I think it's worth noting that this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, or the NEJM, which is one of the most widely read medical journals in the world. It's literally one of the top 3 most widely read journals that publishes biomedical research in the world. And so if a study is published in this journal, essentially every scientist and physician who's interested in this domain of biomedical science is going to read it. Hey, Tim. Hello from Philadelphia. So not only that, right, but this is a group out of Imperial College London, one of the top neuroscience institutions in the world. And not only that, but one of the authors on the study, the sort of senior investigator, served as an advisor to the Ministry of Defense, Department of Health, and Home Office in the United Kingdom, Professor Dr. David Nutt. And so, he's a fairly world-renowned neuropsychopharmacologist who's been one of the most scientifically courageous investigators worldwide, okay? And so, in other words, this study has all the ingredients of an absolutely exciting bit of science. And so, let's dive in. So, this was a double-blind, randomized, controlled trial. So, what does that mean? First, double-blind means that both the patients and the researchers have no idea which patients received the treatment of interest, okay? The researchers provide a treatment to one of the study participants, and they have no idea if they're providing a sugar pill or the thing they're actually studying. Next, what does randomized mean? So, it's probably a little bit more intuitive than double-blind. So there's nothing that determines whether a study participant is going to get a sugar pill or a treatment of interest. It's purely random. And so I've said sugar pill a few times. And so sugar pill is an informal term that's used to refer to placebo, right? A treatment that has no meaningful biological effect, at least in the thing that the scientists are studying, right? But In a study like this one, we're actually not comparing this experimental treatment to the absence of a treatment. We're comparing it to the standard treatment for depression. Okay, so we're comparing an antidepressant called Escitalopram or Lexapro to a far more infamous molecule, a molecule that's produced by an entirely separate biological kingdom fungi or fungi. And so this is a molecule called psilocybin. And so here is our friend psilocybin. And so, you know, I know in the initial thumbnail, I have Prozac in the title, which is fluoxetine. It's not escitalopram, but their pharmacologies are just about the same. And I suspect far more people are familiar with Prozac than they are with Lexapro, which is the brand name for escitalopram. So they're essentially interchangeable, not entirely, but essentially. So, hey, what's up, Abyss? Thanks for coming by, man. Good to see you too. Will these 10-year-old mushrooms still work? You know, there's some interesting chemistry that happens as psilocybin-containing mushrooms age and dry out. So psilocybin can convert to a different, still psychedelic compound, but not psilocybin. I believe it's baeocystine. So it'll still have an effect, but the pharmacology will be a little bit different. You know, more similar than, you know, psilocybin compared to like caffeine, but it will be different. And so yeah, shelf life is a concern when it comes to you know, these psilocybin-containing fungi. So I've gone into the pharmacology of psilocybin in the past, so let's not dwell too long on this, but I think if we just take a look at the shape of a neurotransmitter with which you might be familiar, serotonin, I think you'll get the picture. And so, you know, I know just looking at these chemical structures isn't particularly edifying, right? But just look at two main things. We have a hexagon, just look at the shape, right? We have a hexagon next to a pentagon, and that pentagon has an NH in it. And then there's this wiggly tail with an NH at the end, right? You know, there's some very important differences beyond just those similarities, right? But fundamentally, these are pretty similar molecules. And so as a result, psilocybin can do a lot of the same things that our own serotonin can do. You know, notably, it can bind the neurotransmitter receptors that serotonin binds, but it can do a few additional things, right? Interacting with various targets in the brain in a way that serotonin doesn't, and even changing the way serotonin itself behaves within our brain is trafficked, right? And so, you know, many parts of the brain that serotonin influences and regulates, which is very wide range of, you know, things that encode various aspects of our consciousness and our experience, things like our emotional states, our appetite, our memory, and maybe most infamously, our sensory systems like vision, but also our auditory system and so on, right? All those systems can be influenced by a molecule like psilocybin because those things are regulated by serotonin, right? And so, you know, it's a molecule that's kind of sort of wearing a serotonin costume, okay? And so psilocybin is probably one of the most well-known molecules among people outside of neuropharmacology and neuroscience who, you know, like have an interest at least in altered states of consciousness. But I realize that, you know, many folks aren't necessarily in that category, and they might just first be hearing about this molecule because they're on a journey to find a better treatment for depression. And so, you know, broadly speaking, this is a molecule that's found in a whole variety of mushrooms, as we were talking about earlier. And so here are some of the more common ones, along with one that I think is particularly interesting, at least to me. So the two ones that look like mushrooms, those are cubensis and senolentiata. And those are some of the more common ones that people, you know, consume. But there are many, many dozens of types of mushrooms that produce this molecule, even some that grow similarly to truffles, which is what you're seeing in the corner there, Hollandia. They're not technically truffles, but they kind of grow like truffles. And so, you know, briefly, the effects of psilocybin are pretty complicated, right? You know, remember that serotonin signaling influences a ton of different aspects of our consciousness and experience, right? And so as a result, the effects of a substance that can, you know, interact with part of that signaling system, that serotonergic serotonin signaling system, will be similarly diverse, okay? And so, you know, obviously probably the most well-known effects of psilocybin are its visual effects or its effects on our vision. But I think that there's a misunderstanding regarding how it affects our vision, because at least some people assume, at least in my experience, they assume that because it's a hallucinogen, it'll cause people to see completely realistic things that just simply aren't there, right? Like you might randomly see a totally realistic cat just walk across your screen, or you might be having conversations with people who aren't there just as though they really were there. That's not exactly how this works, right? At least, you know, at the doses that most people consume, right? Rather, what it does is it distorts existing visual stimuli. Okay, so straight lines might start to get a little wavy. The walls might start to bend in and out as though they're breathing. You might begin to see patterns on things like, textured walls or like popcorn ceilings or in clouds that aren't actually there. Colors can be a little bit more striking or a lot more striking. And if you're, let's just give you an example. If you're looking at like some wood, right, that has those sort of natural variations and growth patterns and stuff, those patterns can begin to drift a little bit. Facial perception can be altered, where you become like strangely hypersensitive to certain features of a face. Facial expressions can be significantly like amplified or magnified or at least altered. It's things like that, right? It's not like you're seeing completely realistic hallucinations. That's associated with a different class of hallucinogenic substances called deliriums. But the visual effects of psilocybin are really only part of the repertoire of effects that this substance induces. So, for example, time perception can be dramatically altered, where 5 minutes can feel like 2 hours, or 2 hours can feel like 5 minutes. Emotionality can be affected, where you begin to have emotional experiences induced by sensory stimuli that just wouldn't normally elicit those reactions, right? Like looking at a piece of art or listening to a song or revisiting a memory, right? Essentially, any conscious experience can elicit this like strangely magnified and volatile emotional experience that just wouldn't normally happen. Hypervigilance. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I suppose. That's not one of the sort of classically, that's not a state of conscious or an effect that's classically associated with psychedelics, but I could imagine, yeah, that makes sense. I'm coincidentally wearing my magic mushroom shirt. No way, really, that's funny. Oh, blazing blasphemer. And so, okay, so Abyss says, I was wondering what are the findings on psilocybin or any serotonin agonist antagonist effect on the enteric system? Yes, excellent point. So Abyss is bringing up the enteric system. That's essentially the nervous system that regulates our gastrointestinal tract, our stomach and our gut and stuff like that. Sorry. And so that's an interesting question, because the enteric nervous system produces a ton of serotonin. It has serotonin receptors, different sort of subtypes of serotonin receptors that tend to be in the brain, but still serotonin will bind them. And yeah, one of the sort of classic, experiences that people have when they're exposed to one of these substances is their gastrointestinal system gets weird. It feels different. It feels uncomfortable. And so, yeah, there is an altered state of enteric consciousness, right? Not consciousness, obviously, I'm joking, but yeah, there are effects there for sure. Like you'll read of people saying like, I could tell that the, substance was starting to take effect because I could feel my gut starting to react. It's not like painful or anything like that. It's just, it feels weird, it feels different. Okay, so there are a ton of effects of this substance, a substance like psilocybin, right? Effects on things like cognition, right? This is extending beyond their sensory effects, things like cognition, like the thoughts and the association between thoughts and ideas that you experience, that can be altered. Appetite, olfaction, and gustation, right? Or our senses of smell and taste, those can be altered, as well as how all of these senses interact and influence one another. Right? That could be altered. But for today, it's the molecule's effects on emotional states, something called suggestibility, that are most important, right, when it comes to depression. And so suggestibility refers to a sort of state where people become more receptive to interactions with other people. And in the prospective application of psilocybin as a treatment for depression, people can become more receptive to the therapy delivered by an experienced therapist, right? And so I've talked about the prospect of MDMA, another infamous substance that's actually a bit further along in the process of really likely becoming a medication that can be prescribed for the treatment of psychiatric conditions. Well, probably the central therapeutic effect of MDMA is that it amplifies suggestibility, making people who've experienced, severe trauma, life-changing trauma, and will therefore tend to be, a bit closed off and wary of interpersonal interaction. It can help them to open up a bit and be a little bit more receptive to the input of a therapist, rendering therapy more effective. And so, I've had those conversations in the past about MDMA. And so, a similar theme is going on with psilocybin. Enhancing suggestibility seems to put people in this state of consciousness that just amplifies the efficacy of therapy, which can be extremely helpful when trying to treat or live with a psychiatric condition like depression or PTSD. Which are extremely difficult to treat and for which we have few effective treatments. And so, so Chris brings up Chris Weingart. I'm sorry, I always read that as Weingart. I don't know why. Sorry about that, Chris. What about it makes you want to get outside into nature? Yeah, I mean, interesting question. I mean, so I could only speculate. And, you know, I agree, Chris, that very, very frequently people will either want to have these experiences out in nature, or they'll feel motivated to go into nature or natural settings. So my speculation would be it's more of a sort of set and setting effect. So set and setting is a phrase I'm sure you're familiar, but that refers to how the setting, the environment in which you are, and also your mindset influence the sort of trajectory of the experience, rather than like there is some pharmacological effect of psilocybin that makes people want to be in a forest, right? I think it's more people have expectations, people have associations of you know these mushrooms as being natural and being part of the earth, and so I think it's more just people have that association, and therefore that association either initially motivates them to just want to be in nature, or that or that you know they have that association already, the substance takes its effect, and all of a sudden that association becomes, you know, amplified, right? And now they want to engage that. It could be that. It could be something as simple as, you know, most of us don't spend very much time in nature, like in bona fide nature, right? And so there's a lot of novelty there as a result, right? You don't, it's not every day that you spend, you know, a day or an entire day in a desert, right? Or in a forest or whatever. I mean, for some people it is, but for a lot of people, I think it's, you know, as a result, because people don't spend that much time in those environments, there's just a lot of novel stimuli to be experienced under the influence of this substance that will alter those experiences, right? That's what I think more it is, more so than, you know, a pharmacological effect of psilocybin, because after all, the pharmacology of psilocybin is pretty similar, not identical. There's always differences, but pretty similar to LSD, you know, other psychedelic compounds, DMT. In fact, psilocybin is essentially a modified dimethyltryptamine DMT molecule. It's DMT, but with a you know, I'll show you a phosphoryl group off the phenyl ring, right? So you see that O with the P with all the O's and then the H. That is the difference between dimethyltryptamine and psilocybin for phosphoryl dimethyltryptamine. The dimethyl refers to those two lines coming off that N at the end of that wiggly tail. Those are two methyl groups, dimethyl, right? And so yeah, and then the rest is tryptamine, right? Okay, so yeah, so but it is an interesting question for sure. And so okay, so hey, what's up, Cosmic Bros? Thanks for coming. Interesting that you bring up distorted time perception. Abyss says this, time perception with serotonin and time perception. So I remember reading the same effect with Parkinson's, yeah, patients with L-DOPA treatment. I may have to go back and review the paper. I think we've actually talked about that in the past. Yeah, super interesting, right? Yeah, and you know, to be clear, like I'm certainly not suggesting that time perception is solely regulated by serotonin. You know, something as complicated as time perception is going to be influenced by a whole variety of signaling systems, all of the monoamines, which includes, you know, both dopamine and serotonin. So, and I should say for anybody who's unfamiliar, L-DOPA, you know, Parkinson's disease is a condition of a deficit of dopamine. Essentially, it's the death of dopamine-producing neurons in a certain part of the brain called the substantia nigra, pars compacta. And L-DOPA is a molecule that essentially can become essentially dopamine. If you can get it into the brain, no trivial task, but we can do it. And so that is one of the pretty long-lived treatments of Parkinson's disease. And as Abyss was bringing up, L-DOPA has a bunch of really sort of surprising effects. Surprising if you don't, if you're unfamiliar with dopaminergic signaling, what dopamine does. So for example, so Abyss is saying that it alters time perception. It also causes people, there are stories of people who never gambled before in their lives or weren't really risk takers, you know, they're diagnosed with Parkinson's, they're prescribed L-DOPA with carbidopa or whatever. And all of a sudden they become these like risks. There's a ton of risk-seeking behaviors. They become gambling addicts. Their libido gets you know, substantially altered. And so, yeah, just another line of evidence that the relationship between brain activity and behavior and stuff is almost one-to-one, right? And so, okay, so let me, let's continue on with psilocybin. So, so when it comes to psilocybin, you know, there already have been several clinical trials to explore whether it might be useful for the treatment of depression and anxiety. And so at the time of this video, there's been one open label trial which means that everyone, including both the patient and the clinician, knows which treatment they're getting, as well as there have also been 4 randomized controlled trials of psilocybin for the treatment of psychiatric conditions, okay? And so generally speaking, these trials have demonstrated reduced symptoms of depression after just 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin. And so this group was inspired to conduct their own clinical trial. And so what they did is a phase 2 double-blind randomized controlled trial with individuals who had moderate to severe major depressive disorder. And they were comparing psilocybin to one of the more widely prescribed antidepressants, Escitalopram, right? You might know it as Lexapro. And so, this is basically the gold standard of clinical trials, right? It doesn't get much more rigorous than, a trial that's double blind, where neither the clinician nor the patient knows what the patient is getting. That's also randomized, where the collection of patients who end up receiving the experimental treatment, in this case psilocybin, is completely random and not based on any selection criteria. Like, for example, one selection criteria that I could imagine being justified is, they might only want people who've had past experiences with psilocybin and exclude people who don't, or only want people who have never had, past experience with psilocybin, because that will change. People will know what to expect or not know what to expect, right? So they didn't include any exclusion criteria like that. And I'm sorry, they didn't select their, who was receiving what by any criteria like that. It's completely random. And then, also this is unique in that, or this is a gold standard type of clinical trial, because the experimental treatment, psilocybin in this case, is being compared to a medication, right? That's really one of the frontline treatments for depression, Escitalopram or Lexapro. Okay, so pretty great. And so C.S. Murphy brings up, are you familiar with Terence McKenna, anthropoid? Yes. Curious your take on him and his brother Dennis McKenna. Yeah. So for anybody who's unfamiliar with this whole world, Terence is, I think it's safe to say, maybe the more prominent of the two in the sort of the community of people who are interested in this sort of category of mind-altering substances. They've had various, sort of speculative theories about the relationship that humans have had with specifically psilocybin-containing mushrooms over, history, almost like anthropological takes. From my perspective, I think that they're very interesting thinkers and super valuable, members of this community. But I do think that they're a little bit loose with how how stringent they are. But when it comes to making these claims, right? And so, they'll talk about the stoned ape hypothesis, where the argument that why is it that Homo sapiens are so much more intelligent than other primates, right? And it seemed to happen fairly rapidly. Well, from their perspective, it seemed to happen fairly rapidly. It didn't happen that rapidly, right? Evolutionarily speaking, and so their argument is that. And there are records of ancient, let's say, Homo sapiens consuming these substances, and then they go into sort of what they would call references in sort of biblical texts to hallucinogenic substances and stuff like that, and so that's all very fun and very interesting. I'm coming at this entire topic from the perspective of a scientist, right? And so I want to see real hard causative evidence, right? And when it comes to why it is, for example, why it is that humans are so intelligent. I mean, so I've talked about some lines of evidence that can explain why it is that humans are so much more intelligent than any other animal on this platform in the past. But the reality is you don't really need to invoke a pharmacological explanation. And not only that, the way that a substance like psilocybin interacts with our biology is not such that it could dramatically alter neurophysiological architecture, which is what you would need, fundamentally rewiring certain regions of the brain, making certain regions grow larger, specifically frontal regions, making other regions grow smaller. That's just not how this substance interacts with the brain, right? There are substances that theoretically could, but they certainly didn't exist back then, right? It would be like gene editing, platforms and stuff like that. But that all said, and I think, was it Terence McKenna who talked about the machine elves when it comes to dimethyltryptamine, DMT, for anybody who's unfamiliar. Well, yeah, we just talked about it. So I think there's a lot of romance in their writing, and I still think they're valuable members of the community. And hey, what's wrong with a little bit of romance and prose when trying to understand these topics in biology? But, once again, I don't think we need to invoke those. If you're interested in, okay, but what really happened, right? I think that basing those perspectives on evidence-based science, right, is the best way forward that we have at our disposal. So yeah, I know that was a long conversation, but I know people feel very strongly about that sort of facet of the community. And so, yeah, I'm trying to thread a needle here. Thread a needle, I guess. Is that the idiom? Anyways, I'm not trying to, criticize them very much, but I'm just, there are certain points where I think that, that one has to make a choice as to whether or not they want to base their beliefs about human intelligence on evidence and, science or more sort of storytelling. Okay. No IUPAC names, please. By the time you're done with naming one of these chemicals, time will lapse. Yeah. It's funny. One of my friends now works with IUPAC. For anybody who's unfamiliar with IUPAC, IUPAC is a sort of international standard of how chemicals are named. And it is one of the more brutal parts of having to learn organic chemistry. What are the contraindications for this mushroom? Any? Yes. So there's several different kinds. So in terms of like actual potentially dangerous interactions with other substances, usually other medications, it is theoretically possible that if somebody's on a certain medication that elevates serotonin levels, taking a substance like psilocybin might lower seizure threshold, might, in other words, bring them closer to potentially experiencing something called serotonin toxicity, used to be called serotonin syndrome, which is essentially just inducing a seizure by having levels of serotonin that are too high. That's a potential problem. And then in terms of, just, beyond pharmacological interactions, people who have a family history or a personal history of experiencing psychosis, schizophrenia, these types of conditions, generally speaking, it's generally not a great idea to really to ingest really any mind-altering substance. But that includes psilocybin, and they speak to this in this study actually. Okay. Hey, from Spring Garden. Oh, hey, what's up? Wait, Captain Rehab, I thought you were in Fishtown. Huh. Spring Garden is a part of Philly. You can almost see it from here. Actually, it's just a little bit further north than. Anyways, okay. So I said that this is a phase 2 clinical trial, right? And so the clinical trial phases, and we won't spend too much time on this because it's very not interesting, but just so you know where we are, where this study is in terms of the sort of the trajectory of psilocybin potentially becoming a medication, right? So a phase 2 clinical trial is when a medication has already been evaluated for safety in humans. So, questions like, does this molecule kill people, have been asked and answered. Does it cause obvious damage to organ systems like the liver or the heart or the brain, right? Those questions have been answered, or at least pretty much answered. So it's definitely, beyond that, it's already undergone testing in the kind of lab settings in which I worked, right? Preclinical studies, right? That's where the basic biology of the medication or the prospective medication is established. What does the molecule do when it's in the body? What receptors does it bind? What enzymes does it influence? How does it influence the behavior of animal models like non-human primates or rodents, right? So those studies have already been done. Phase 2 is when we add quite a bit more people to the trial, rather than just a few handful of people who are valiantly volunteering to be, the first to test out a new possible medication to see if it causes any negative reactions. We're beyond that. We're talking about a few dozen people now. And the questions extend beyond just whether the molecule is dangerous. Now we're curious about whether the molecule might become a medication, right? Whether it might be effective, might be an effective treatment for a given condition. And this was conducted in the United Kingdom, so there may be some slight variations in how they organize their phases, but I'm obviously most familiar with the system in the United States, but generally speaking, they're almost certainly quite similar. So once again, they're working with patients who had long-standing moderate to severe major depressive disorder, and they were comparing psilocybin to escitalopram, right? And they did it over a 6-week period. Okay. Blazing Blasphemer, my pleasure, man. And so C.S. Murphy says, I really think there's a certain intelligence that appears when you're on certain doses. Things I couldn't possibly imagine appearing in front of me. It's surreal and hard to English these experiences, but it has changed the way I imagine create art completely. I appreciate you answering my question. Thanks. Oh, my pleasure, man. It's interesting stuff. And I definitely do not disagree with that. There's no question that it's an altered state of consciousness, right? And there are ramifications, or there are implications for that, right? You know, intelligence is, you know, just at least in the world of neuroscience, it means a specific thing. But, you know, I think the way that you're using it is totally fair. I definitely wouldn't disagree that, you know, some of the effects of these substances just change the way they alter cognition, right? They change the way ideas are associated with one another, how our sensory systems influence those ideas, those thoughts, memories for sure. And so, yeah, I mean, and that's potentially valuable, right? Okay, so when it comes to who the patients were, they enrolled both men and women, 59 altogether, between the ages of 18 and 80, which is quite a range. The average age was 41 years old. And they found them through the sort of standard clinical trial awareness pipelines, right? You know, physician, recommendations and that kind of stuff, like notifications that this clinical trial is going on, that kind of thing. Government, via the government. But then they also use social media and then other sources, which led to prospective participants, visiting their website, right? And so when it comes to how long they'd been diagnosed with depression, folks who ended up receiving psilocybin had been formally diagnosed with depression for an average of 22 years, while the Lexapro group had been for an average of 15, right? So that's the average, right? So obviously, it varies, but that's a pretty long time. And so frankly, it'd be interesting for me, at least from my perspective, to know what other sources they used, because if they were relying like heavily on social media, you have to wonder if they were selecting for a certain kind of individual who's fairly internet savvy, social media savvy, particularly given the fact that they included folks who are a bit older than your standard social media savvy millennial or Zoomer or whatever, right? And so, it's not a big deal, to be clear, but it would just be interesting to know. Okay. Hey, Gemma, thanks for coming by. Okay, and so like all clinical trials, they did have exclusion criteria. It's not unique to this trial. Every trial has that. And what exclusion criteria mean is the characteristics that someone might have that make the researchers decide to not include them in the study, okay? And so, frankly, I think the main one that they applied is totally justified, right? So they didn't include, as we were talking about earlier with the topic on contraindications that Tim brought up, the sort of main exclusion criteria was a history of psychosis. So, but then they also included, significant health conditions, a history of suicide attempts, a positive pregnancy test, any contraindications with taking an SSRI, because after all, some of the participants were going to be taking Lexapro daily, previous use of Lexapro, or a history of another psychiatric condition like borderline personality disorder. Okay, so I won't go into like why I think all of those exclusion criteria are justified, but the main point to keep in mind is that when it comes to clinical trials at this stage, the goal is to test a very specific molecule under very specific circumstances, right? The question isn't, is psilocybin an ideal medication for everyone who's been diagnosed with depression, right? The question is psilocybin safe and effective for someone diagnosed with moderate to severe depression compared to a standard treatment for depression, right? That's a very specific question. And so as a result, you want to make sure that the folks who participate in this study, they don't pertain to a different question, like is psilocybin safe and effective for the treatment of someone who's been diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder, right? That's a different question. Or for someone who's had a history of psychosis. And, to be clear, like the molecule may very well be just fine, for folks, maybe even, beneficial for folks who have more complicated psychiatric backgrounds than solely being diagnosed with depression for a long time, right? But this is one of the sort of the early hurdles. This trial is one of the early hurdles that a molecule has to pass to become a medication. And so it's always important to make sure that the assessments of the molecule are very specifically targeted. You want to set the trial up for the greatest possible chance of success of at least answering the question, right? So so Gemma says, I came off cold turkey from my antidepressants. Wow, I do not advise this, mind. However, it was affecting my health too much. Yeah, so yeah, antidepressants, right. Yeah, that's generally speaking not recommended. And particularly because for some antidepressants, going cold turkey can be actually a little bit dangerous, particularly the noradrenergic ones, the SNRIs. But yeah, generally speaking, as you recognize, Gemma, generally speaking, you want to consult with a physician, because maybe rather than completely stopping them, maybe just trying a different one or adjusting dose, something like that. But anyways, so Interestingly, in this study, among all the exclusion criteria, they did not exclude people who did have prior experience with psilocybin. So in other words, some of the participants likely knew what to expect when it comes to psilocybin, while some of them didn't. And I don't think that's like a massively significant confounding factor that totally compromises this whole study or anything like that. But when it comes to the effects of substance like psilocybin, right? Anybody with experience with the substance, you know, this has a very dramatically alters a person's state of consciousness, right? And so, you know, there's a pretty big difference between knowing what to expect and having zero expectations whatsoever, right? So not the hugest deal, but interesting nonetheless. And to be fair, all of the psilocybin participants had 2 exposures, right? And so, so at least by the second one, everybody knew what to expect. Okay, so the scientists also had all of the participants undergo fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, basically a brain scan, and a whole series of tests to evaluate their cognition and their emotional status. And they also had an initial therapy session to prepare for the big day, right? And on the big day, the patients who received psilocybin were given 25 milligrams, which to be clear is like a pretty serious dose, right? And dosing when it comes to this substance, particularly, it can be pretty tricky. So, you know, remember how there's tons and tons of different types of mushrooms that produce psilocybin. But the difficulty is that they don't all produce the same amount of psilocybin, the same concentration. Some produce far more than others. Some produce other, tryptamine, psychoactive, pharmacologically active molecules beyond just psilocybin. And of course, some mushrooms are just bigger, some larger than others, when someone receives them. And so, a lot of folks who are experienced with the substance via the mushrooms, as opposed to, extraction of psilocybin or something like that, a lot of those folks will focus on the weight of the mushrooms, not the actual dose of psilocybin itself, which makes sense because it's not like you can see the psilocybin, right? All you can see is the mushroom. And so they just weigh the mushroom. Thank you very much for the super heart, Jenna. That's very generous of you. I appreciate it. And so, but broadly speaking, 25 milligrams of psilocybin is a dose that will induce substantial hallucinogenic effects. And so, okay, on the big day, right? The participants received their psilocybin while listening to a specific playlist of music, curated playlist of music, and they're being guided by a psychological support team. And to be clear, that support team was present for both the psilocybin and the Escitalopram or Lexapro groups. And I meant to check to see if they actually included a link to their playlist. Like I've read, a past study of psilocybin for the treatment of psychiatric conditions, and they did the same thing. They had this like music playlist, and they published it. Like you could go listen to it if you wanted on the internet. It's pretty cool. But I don't think that they did this in this study. But anyways, so interestingly, the group of folks who ended up receiving Lexapro, they also received psilocybin. They received 1 milligram of psilocybin. So everybody got some, and everyone was told that they'd receive psilocybin, which is probably why they provided that 1 milligram. So technically, they did all get psilocybin, and 1 milligram is expected to have minimal noticeable effects. Of course. And so, thanks for the super heart, man. Or I'm sorry, the appreciator. Thanks, Abbas. I appreciate it, man. I appreciate you. And so, okay, so everybody got psilocybin, right? And they had, trained mental health professionals on hand for each of the dosing days. And, everyone, just like everybody got psilocybin, everyone was told to take a capsule every morning. And the capsules contained either Lexapro or cellulose, which is what the psilocybin group was given, right? Or a sugar pill, let's say. And so the second dose of psilocybin was given 3 weeks after the first dose. And then patients were evaluated the next day after that second dose. Everybody came back to be evaluated once again 3 weeks after that, okay, where they did all kinds of tests to get a sense of where everybody was, right, after all the treatments. Okay, so how did they gauge whether, people actually improved? And so here you can see an example. So this is the Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomatology Self-Report, or QIDS-SR16, QIDS, kids, I guess, which, as you can see, is a sort of a simple set of questions, right? That someone answers to get a sense of how their symptoms of depression may have changed over time. And the test touches on all the sort of main features of depression that are described in the primary manual of psychiatric conditions that's used throughout the United States. And, there's an equivalent that's used, very, very similar, that's used outside of the United States. Okay, so let's get to what they actually found. Here we go. All right, let's see. Yeah, that's not bad. So simple graph, kind of nice. So the blue line is the Lexapro group, the Escitalopram group. The red line is the psilocybin group. And we're looking at their KIDS score, their QIDS score, right? That survey of depressive symptoms, how it changed over time, okay? Starting when the first psilocybin dose was administered to, well, I guess everybody, but to the psilocybin group. And so as you can see, the QIDS score, and again, that's the test to get a sense of where people are with their symptoms of depression, is persistently lower in the group who received the major psilocybin dose, right? And so when it comes to this test, lower scores equate to less severe symptoms of depression, okay? And so, these data are showing that the participants' own sense of their state of mind had improved more than the group who was receiving their daily Lexapro. So that's pretty exciting, right? Pretty interesting. But when it comes to this kind of science, we run statistical tests to get a sense of just how significant these differences really are. And it's possible that these two groups are essentially, responding equivalently, right? But it just so happens that the group receiving psilocybin in this specific iteration of, this specific clinical trial in this moment in time, it just by chance tended to experience slightly reduced scores on this test of depressive symptoms. But in a future study, they might just as likely see the opposite results, right? So it turns out that there was no significant statistical difference between these groups. Okay, there's clearly a trend, right? But no significant difference. And at least when it comes to the QIDS score, right? And so did they do something else? They did. They had another test. So in addition to that QIDS score, that they conducted, we just talked about, they had the participants go through a variety of other tests. And one of them was the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, or WEMWBS, okay? And so, you can see some examples of the types of questions that this test asks. But anyways, it's basically just another way to do the same thing that the QIDS test does, right? Get a sense of how people are doing by asking them questions about how they're feeling in a variety of ways, right? Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate the Appreciate Award. Your lecture is depressing me. Well, you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. Stick around. Okay, so here's what they found. Well, I guess it depends on why you're getting depressed, but here's what they found with this WEMWBS test. So once again, we're seeing the Lexapro group in blue, the blue line, and the psilocybin group in red. And this is how they responded to that WEMWBS score over a bit over 40 days, right? And so keep in mind when it comes to this test, the QIDS test, higher scores, as opposed to the QIDS score, higher scores indicate, improvements in mental well-being. No thanks, bye. Okay, take it easy, man. Thanks for letting me know that. So, this is looking pretty good, right? Once again, however, they were unable to identify statistically significant effects of psilocybin, even with this test. And so, once again, with this score, higher scores mean improvements in mental well-being, whereas lower scores in the other one meant basically a reduction in the severity of symptoms of depression, right? So both showing pretty much the same thing. And, once again, it's looking pretty good, but once again, they didn't, these data did not achieve statistical significance. And this was due in part to how they conducted their statistical tests and how, they designed the study, really how they conducted the study, and COVID-19 kind of interfered with that a little bit. But okay, so where does this leave us? So fundamentally, we can't say that psilocybin is more effective than escitalopram or Lexapro when it comes to treating depression. Okay, it certainly looks good. And we can't say that it's worse than daily treatment with Lexapro for the treatment of depression, as opposed to just 2 treatments with psilocybin, right? But the data don't indicate that it's better either. So that said, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the category to which escitalopram or Lexapro belongs, they're fairly notorious for their side effects. So, when it comes to things like dry mouth, reduced emotional responsiveness, sexual dysfunction, the participants who received escitalopram or Lexapro reported higher rates of those side effects than the participants who received psilocybin. Okay, so lower side effect profile. And they also noted that 4 patients who were receiving escitalopram stopped taking their daily dose altogether, and one of them cut their dose in half because they felt like they were experiencing negative side effects. Okay, and the group notes that no one in the psilocybin group wanted to avoid that second dose. Right, once everybody knew what to expect, by the effects of 25 milligrams of psilocybin, right? Nobody dropped out in the psilocybin group. They did lose 3 participants some of the participants didn't stick around for the entire duration of the test, 3 altogether. And this was due largely to just limitations imposed by COVID-19. And so 2 of those people were in the psilocybin group and 1 was in the Escitalopram group, but it didn't have anything to do with side effects or an aversive reaction. Okay. So where does this leave us? So what we're seeing is a pretty meaningful improvement in depression scores among the group who received psilocybin, right? Not statistically significantly different from escitalopram, but still a meaningful improvement. And the group did see an improvement in depression scores in 70% of the participants who received their psilocybin, right? While they only saw improvements in 48% of the escitalopram group. Okay, so once again, this is encouraging. So more people who received psilocybin experienced improvements in their mental health than did in the escitalopram, the Lexapro group. So that's encouraging, but it's still somewhat inconclusive. Okay, so here's what Professor David Nutt, very, very world-renowned neuropharmacologist in the United Kingdom, has to say. Quote, "These findings provide further support for the growing evidence base that shows that in people with depression, psilocybin offers an alternative treatment to traditional antidepressants." End quote. Okay. And then later he says, quote, "In our study, psilocybin worked faster than escitalopram and was well tolerated, with very different adverse effects profile. We look forward to further trials which, if positive, should lead to psilocybin becoming a licensed medicine." And so, end quote. And I sort of giggled there because, he says a different adverse effects profile, which is like, yeah. So, the group receiving Lexapro, escitalopram, they got dry mouth, they, had blunted affect, they had sexual dysfunction. But in the psilocybin group, they were seeing the walls breathe. It's just like, I guess that's an adverse reaction, but I don't think it technically qualifies. If you're taking psilocybin, you got it. I think it's safe to say that it's not a side effect. It's not a bug. It's a feature for at least some people. But anyways, different adverse effects profile. Take that for what you will. But and then Dr. Carhart Harris. So David Nutt was the senior scientist on this clinical trial. Dr. Carhart Harris is the lead scientist on the study, right? The first author. And so they said, quote, "These latest findings build on our previous research testing psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression and to offer the most compelling evidence yet to support efforts towards licensing psilocybin therapy as a regulated mental health intervention." End quote. So frankly, I can't disagree with either of those statements. And I'm excited by these results, right? And that's why I was saying, if the lack of statistical significance was depressing to anybody, they shouldn't be depressed, because it's actually not altogether bad. These aren't altogether bad results if you're interested in novel treatments for depression, right? Coming to a pharmacy near you, or really a physician's office near you. I think that person was just trolling me. But anyways, so, they could have been more compelling, right? If it turned out that psilocybin was even more effective than Lexapro, frontline treatment for depression. But it's certainly not bad. It's equivalently effective at a minimum. And so, another thing is that this study was hampered by a whole variety of factors, but not the least of which was evidently the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Which, prevented some of their participants from participating in the clinical trial, but I have to imagine also affected the psychological states of the participants in like a pretty singular way that like wouldn't normally be in effect. It's not every year that we have a pandemic, right? That is taking the lives of millions of people. And, particularly people who are, a little bit older, right? And so yeah, I mean, this study was conducted in a unique time. And so yeah, all important context when you're interpreting these data, right? There are other limitations of this study, but I'm not honestly driven to suspect that there would be significant differences if those limitations were addressed. So it's not even worth talking about them. So fundamentally, the reason I'm excited is that we are in need of new treatments for depression. We have been for a long time, for all the reasons I discussed in the beginning, but also because we just don't have all that many effective medications available to treat this growing threat to human well-being, right? So any new tool in the toolbox, or the armamentarium, that's available to physicians who are trying to reduce human suffering, due to these psychiatric maladies is welcome, right? And these are some encouraging results, just another tool. And I'm looking forward to seeing a larger study that incorporates a broader sample of the population, more than 59 people, that's conducted when there isn't a pandemic raging, plaguing, the entire globe of Homo sapiens. And, a study that's conducted for a longer period of time, so that they follow these patients for, months, maybe even years, to see how their, symptoms of depression change over time. Maybe more psilocybin dosing events, right? Rather than just 2, maybe you do 1 every, I don't know, month or 2 months, something like that, right? I think it would be interesting to sort of monkey around a little bit with their dosing regimen. Not that I have any strong predictions there, but, for example, when it comes to ketamine treatment for depression, it's tricky to find that optimal dosage, right? That optimal dosing schedule. And, it's not like it's just one and done. You go in, your dose of ketamine. Ketamine is not a psychedelic hallucinogen. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic that is hallucinogenic, but completely different pharmacology. It doesn't share very much in common at all with the psychedelic substances like psilocybin or LSD or mescaline and so on. So ketamine has proven to be rather effective for people with treatment-resistant depression. And it looks like psilocybin may very well as well. And so that's exciting. But until those studies are conducted, thank you very much for watching, for hanging out. Thank you for the awards. I really appreciate them. And, if you dig this kind of discussion and you're not, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all that kind of stuff, sharing, I guess. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Okay, so what are your thoughts on Cerebral X? A new nootropic on the market supposed to enhance memory. Let's see what's in it. Cerebral X. Let's see what's in it. I've not heard of this, but I suspect I could predict what's inside of it. What is it? What's in it? Cerebral X contents. Okay, so it has green tea extract. What? No. If it's just that. Oh, okay, here we go. Okay. Yes, it has maca root, Tribulus terrestris, really. Avena sativa, Mirina puauma root. I'm not familiar with that one. Bark powder. I wonder if that's Mucuna pruriens. It's just like a different word for it. So Tribulus terrestris, that's an interesting one to include. Tribulus is known for elevating testosterone levels. It's like if you go into any kind of supplement store or whatever, and they have like testosterone boosters or test boosters, it very likely it's just Tribulus terrestris, and it does reliably increase testosterone levels. Not like injecting steroids, but definitely will increase testosterone levels. So it can help people to put on muscle. That's interesting, huh? Yeah. I don't. It will also, increase sort of like that perception of energy and stuff like that. Okay, so it also has niacin, and then proprietary blend. So I don't know if there might be something else in there. Generally speaking, when supplements are being marketed to like enhance focus and stuff like that, they'll have something like piracetam or oxiracetam, aniracetam, one of the racetam substances. Or they might have something like Neupept, Neupept is an interesting molecule. Neupept is essentially, if you were to take, there's a word for this, I can't remember what it is in chemistry, but if you were to take a piracetam molecule and attach its mirror image to itself, so it's sort of like 2 connected piracetam molecules, kind of interesting. And I've tried piracetam, oxiracetam, aniracetam, another one. What was the other one? Oh shoot. They're interesting. That was one of the first sort of gimmicky things I did on Periscope was I started a stream, took some oxiracetam, and then had a normal conversation, and then asked people at the beginning, like, do you notice if my behavior, if my my vocabulary changes? And they said I just seemed a little bit energetic. But back in those days, I was always very energetic. Not so much these days. Thank you very much for the award, Hannah. I really appreciate it. And Lucia, thank you so much. And Jason, thank you. and Marcia or Marcia. I'm not 100% sure. I apologize for that, but thank you very much. I appreciate the awards, everybody. He is from the UK, and yet this is all illegal here. Yeah, David Nutt. So David Nutt is, I think, arguably maybe the most outspoken advocate for completely just upending our current drug law, criminal drug laws. He's one of the most effective advocates because he's a very well-respected scientist. And as I said, he served in government. He's doing a lot of interesting things. He's also, his lab has developed an alternative to the ethanol molecule, to alcohol, that isn't as toxic, right? Ethanol is a toxic molecule. It damages organ systems. It's bad for the brain, blah, 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 right? But it's very, very enjoyable. It's one of the most popular drugs in the world. And so they have developed I would like to try it. They've developed a molecule that purportedly induces a lot of the same effects, but doesn't induce a hangover, which is very nice, and isn't toxic. So I can't remember the name, but yeah, he's interesting. I mean, yeah. So and this is all illegal here. It is here too. Yeah, psilocybin is as illegal as a substance can be, which is completely absurd. Just like cannabis, again, completely absurd. That's not going to last for much longer, I can't imagine. But I had to stop taking Escitalopram too. That was a controlled stop. Oh yeah, exactly, right, nice. Yeah, Escitalopram and Escitalopram are pretty similar. And then okay, what are your thoughts on Cerebral X? Yeah, so my takeaway from seeing its ingredients is I would be skeptical. You will feel something. You will feel something. You'll probably feel like you have more energy, but it's almost certainly I would put essentially no stock in it actually having a measurable effect on boosting cognitive performance or things like that. But if you're tired all the time, I mean, it might have some beneficial effect. I wouldn't take it though. And not just because the ingredients strike me as just sort of like, odd. Like, yeah, it also has L-arginine in it. So L-arginine, this, when I'm reading this reads to me like a workout supplement, to be completely honest. It has magnesium. So L-arginine is oftentimes included in workout supplements because it can help to promote vasodilation, essentially, in your arms. Therefore, or I'm sorry, just throughout the body, which increases blood flow, which helps to oxygenate muscles, to deliver nutrients, and so on, right? So that you can push harder. And also, I think people just like it when they're very veiny, right? But like, why would you include that in this? In a cognitive supplement? Yeah, this looks to me like a rebranded workout supplement, to be completely honest. Okay, I've tried every antidepressant in the last 25 years. All quit working after a while. Now I'm on max Vibrid. I'm not familiar with that, and I'm still unmotivated. Maybe I'll try the old mushrooms. Vibrid. I've never heard of that. Maybe that's a medication that's not used in vortioxetine. Huh. Very interesting. I'm actually not familiar with this. Yeah, it's used to treat depression. It's not every day I come by a drug that medication with which I'm unfamiliar. So thank you very much. Cool. Thanks for bringing that up. Well, sorry, it didn't work, but thank you for that. Okay, Anna, enhanced memory, improve focus. They're marketing it basically an ADHD drug for struggling students who need to focus. Yeah, Anna, I mean, again, like maybe it would be helpful. Of course, can't say with altogether certainty that it would be ineffective. But frankly, if you were to compare these ingredients to, any random test booster, workout supplement, growth enhancer, you'd see a lot of overlap. So I think that they were selling this as a workout supplement and then they just changed the label, but I could be wrong. Trolls on social media, never. I was just thinking about that on my drive home yesterday. I honestly missed the trolls from Periscope. I missed them. It was like an athletic sport for me, engaging them. I had fun. Not the people who targeted me for, not the scary ones, but just the people who were like playfully trolling. Like, that was so fun. Anyways, thanks a lot, Chris. I appreciate it, man. Have you heard of Phenibut? Yes. Cannot believe it's legal. Seems dangerous from what I've heard. What do you think? Yeah, Phenibut you're right. It is legal in the US with no prescription. That's right. So Phenibut is an interesting substance. I've talked about it a lot in the past. And for some reason, it's included in the sort of bucket of nootropics, right? So Phenibut it's actually a lot like a substance called baclofen, a medication. Basically, it's a lot like GABA, the neurotransmitter GABA. The trouble with GABA is that it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. If you eat GABA, it's not going into your brain. It's being probably broken down into glutamate and something else, and then potentially converted back to GABA once some of that glutamate gets into the brain. GABA is our nervous system's principal inhibitory off neurotransmitter, and so so for example, like Xanax or alprazolam, benzodiazepines in general, amplifies GABAergic signaling. So alcohol interacts with the GABAergic system. And so GABA doesn't get into the brain from your diet. All the GABA in your brain is synthesized within the brain. I mean, it's a tiny little bit of it, unless you take a absolutely gargantuan dose. That would probably be life-threatening at a certain point. So if you want to try to boost GABA levels, loosely speaking, you have to modify the molecule in this way or that to enable it to get past the blood-brain barrier, to get out of your blood into the brain, right? And so Phenibut is sort of like that. Phenibut interacts with GABAergic receptors, and it definitely has effects. That has way more potent effects than pretty much any other nootropic that I've certainly ever tried or that I've ever heard of. I mean, some people include modafinil or Provigil in the category of nootropics. I don't think that's prudent. The category of nootropics is like, it's an informal category, right? But apart from like modafinil, Phenibut is very strong, and you can, and it's inebriating. And so at a sufficient dose, it's like you're drunk. And it's it has a sort of what seems like a biphasic kind of effect, but anyways, like at lower doses, it's stimulating for some people. That's true for alcohol for some people too, by the way. And then at higher doses, it's inebriating, and it's habit forming for sure, just like every other GABAergic substance. And so people can become addicted to Phenibut. And the withdrawal, just like every other GABAergic substance that people take, psychoactive GABAergic substance, the withdrawal can be dangerous. They're certainly very, very unpleasant, but potentially, lower seizure threshold, and you can essentially experience what's called delirium tremens, what it used to be called, the old school term for alcohol withdrawal. It is weird to me that it has stayed legal. But hey, GHB used to be legal over the counter for a long time. Speaking of the workout community, a lot of people like bodybuilders would take GHB because, and GABA actually does this too, it sort of subtly increases human growth hormone concentrations. And so people would take, and also GHB is euphoric. And it also has that sort of biphasic pharmacological effect where at first it's sedating, and then you have this rebound stimulation. You could buy that in, GNC. I don't know, that's specifically GNC, but like a, supplement store not too long ago. Okay. So, all people miss. Okay. So what kind of mushrooms? Decriminalized here in Denver. Yeah. And I believe somewhere in the Pacific Northwest too. We almost did it. We almost decriminalized in New Jersey. We were like that close. We decriminalized recreational use of cannabis and almost got psilocybin in there as well, but no cigar. Okay, yeah, and what kind of mushrooms? So they were just using psilocybin. I don't believe that they were being dosed with like a ground up mushroom in a capsule or anything like that. I think it was just psilocybin extracted. And so yeah, it'll be unlike, it's sort of like comparing the effects of THC, just THC, to a strain of cannabis, right? Every strain of cannabis is going to have certainly some THC, but not every single strain of cannabis, but essentially, we'll have some THC, but also CBD, cannabigerol, cannabichromine, a bunch of other cannabinoids beyond just THC. And so you're going to have different effects. By the way, this is true for how nicotine and tobacco are studied, right? So nicotine, that people use in e-cigs and stuff like that, it's a substance that has pharmacological effects. Obviously, it's very, very addictive. But tobacco in cigarettes not just cigarettes, but just straight up tobacco has more than just nicotine in it. It has it has molecules that act as MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, that clearly will have pharmacological effects. MAOIs used to be like the go-to antidepressant a long time ago. But yeah. The trolls on Periscope, some are fun. Yeah, I agree. Out of curiosity, if this makes market, would we be looking at a medical cannabis situation here, or can I trade in my prescribed sertraline for this and still go to my career at the fire station taking care of folks. Oh, interesting. You know, so certain professions, I think. So yeah, let's say, okay, yeah, let's go one by one. So if let's say that psilocybin is approved, FDA approved for the treatment of depression, it's not going to be the kind of thing. It's not going to be like cannabis, where you're just going to have. Well, it's not going to be like cannabis in a lot of states, at least, where you can just like go to a pot store and buy some weed, right? It's not. It wouldn't be like that. You would have to. I imagine it would go like this: your psychiatrist would have to prescribe it, and you would only be administered it in a clinical setting. So it wouldn't be like, here's your prescribed psilocybin, you go on your merry way. It would be more clinical, kind of like how ketamine right now is being administered, right? It's not like you're just prescribed ketamine by your physician and then you just go home and take your ketamine. You're administered ketamine by an anesthesiologist. However, if we do legalize psilocybin-containing mushrooms, like we have with cannabis, in a lot of states, then yeah, it would be a little different. It would be more like I think the Netherlands actually made psilocybin-containing mushrooms illegal again, if I remember correctly. But it would be more like at least was in Amsterdam, where you could just buy them. But when you say if you have a job at a fire station, I suspect there will be certain professions where, just like now, where you are prohibited from consuming psilocybin or prohibited from consuming cannabis. And I don't know if your specific job would be implicated in that, but I suspect that's what the legal landscape would look like. Hey, Tubo Coot, good to see you. It's been a long time. Greetings from long lost Periscope Island. Yeah, I can totally see it. That's awesome. Good to see you. When I visited the US, I couldn't believe what you could just buy in shops there, and here's prescription, like melatonin. That's a controlled prescription here. Is that right? My son had it due to side effects of chemo affecting his sleep. Naproxen too. Really, melatonin isn't over the counter in the UK. But interesting, I think in the UK, codeine is over the counter. In Tylenol T3, you can just get codeine. At least it is in Canada. Interesting. That's weird to schedule melatonin, I have to say. Okay, these are currently the main antidepressants here in the United Kingdom, Gemma says, and I've tried nearly all of them, sadly. Pretty much every one of them either didn't really work or gave me horrific side effects. Escitalopram, yeah, so all the brand names are probably going to be different, but Escitalopram, Depoxetine, Escitalopram, Fluoxetine, Fluvoxamine, Paroxetine, and sertraline, Vortioxetine. Yeah, that's the one I wasn't familiar with. Do you happen to know which one, I guess, has the better reputation of working with minimal side effects? No. Yeah, I mean, I've never seen any evidence that would help to predict which, whether somebody will respond adversely to one versus another. I think it is a bit of like the physicians have their own well of experience from which they're drawing when they're prescribing. Like they just tend to not hear as many complaints of side effects with this one rather than that one, which is very valuable insight, by the way. I'm not like diminishing that, but yeah, there's no easy way to predict. It is a bit of a trial and error kind of thing, which is super frustrating, right? And so that's one of the many reasons that I think it's exciting that this kind of work is going on. I figured, thanks for the information. Thank you. Great discussion. Was listening and smiling while fixing my car. Well versed in the exact effects of mushrooms. Yes. Do you have Gemma? I figured. Oh, thanks for the information. And then Anna says, I think I got a seizure from quitting my Ativan cold turkey. Do you think I'll have seizures forever because I did the damage to the brain already? Anna, yeah. So it is possible that that you had a seizure, right? So Ativan is lorazepam. It's a benzodiazepine, and similar to alprazolam or Xanax or diazepam, Valium. And so that is one of the tricky things about benzodiazepines, is that they're very useful medications, particularly for the treatment of certain things. But they're very habit forming. And so, and the withdrawal from benzodiazepines is potentially dangerous for just the reason you're bringing up. You can have seizures. I mean, beyond just how very, very unpleasant it is, right? It is potentially dangerous, sort of like alcohol. And so, yeah, when it comes to benzos, and that's not the case for everybody who's prescribed a benzo, right? If you're prescribed a benzodiazepine and you take it every day, but you're only taking a small amount, you're not going to have seizures. You're going to have a withdrawal syndrome, but you're not going to have seizures. But if you're prescribed a more substantial dose, then it is a very real possibility. So you want to be very, very careful if you're coming off of benzodiazepines, always, no matter what. Even if you're on a low dose, you want to do it with the guidance of your physician. Yes, codeine 8 milligrams over the counter, but melatonin's prescription only, limited time prescription. That's so weird. I don't understand that. All right, I should call it a day. Thank you all so much for hanging out. I appreciate the conversation at the end there. It's been a while since I've been able to do that. So yeah, if you dig this kind of conversation, maybe you'll subscribe wherever you're watching. And if you're not watching on haps.tv, you might want to check it out. It's in my profile on Twitter, a link to it. Also just a link to this video. And so you might want to check out the platform. It's sort of taking the torch from in reference to the Olympics, a torch from Periscope. So otherwise, have a lovely rest of your Wednesday, and I will see you.